On the afternoon of May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy delivered a bold challenge to Congress and the American public.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
This was the speech that made the newly formed Apollo program come to light. Over the course of a decade, from Apollo 1 to the infamous Apollo 11, the Apollo program achieved what seemed impossible, placing the first human footsteps on the moon. This is the story of the Apollo program. In the late 1950s, the United States was falling behind in the space race. The Soviet Union had already launched the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Americans, from citizens to government leaders, were stunned and frustrated. In response, a determined group of engineers and mathematicians at NASA began work on a project that would change history forever. The first step in creating this great program was making a reliable, safe, and dependable rocket that could reach space and, in extension, the moon. At the heart of the Apollo program's rocket creation was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant engineer from Germany. After moving to the United States, he became the force behind the push for moon rockets such as the legendary Saturn V. But within these early days of the Apollo program, he would start by leading engineers to create the Saturn I, the first rocket to be used in the Apollo program and the first Saturn series rocket. For a few years before Kennedy's address to Congress, it was the primary focus for the program, and it would set the stage for all of the other missions to come. With the development of the Saturn I going smoothly, it was set to launch on October 27, 1961, from Cape Canaveral. And in the afternoon, at around 3 p.m., it launched from its pad. The mission was an uncrewed launch, but it would test the technology that would be used for crew flights and the eventual moon landings. The rocket itself was an engineering masterpiece. It was powered by 8 H-1 engines that would output a combined 1.5 million pounds of thrust. In comparison, the Vostok 1, the rocket that sent Gagarin to space, only produced around 900,000 pounds of thrust. That's a little more than half of what the Saturn I could achieve. Following this successful test flight, the American public and leaders were convinced that this was their solution to winning the space race. Consequently, it was set in stone that this program would become the engineering focus for the next decade. With the Saturn I proving itself in a real launch, NASA decided to focus its resources on developing the Apollo program and conducting more ambitious tests. It was during this time, the early 1960s, that NASA started to develop the successor of the Saturn I, the Saturn IB. Each of these rockets was more powerful, more capable, and larger than its predecessor. So, in every test flight, America was getting one step closer to its dream of exploring the stars. But rockets alone were not what made this program as legendary as it was. They needed brave and well-trained astronauts to become the pioneers of space. Throughout the 1960s, astronauts all around the United States trained endlessly. Every day was a mission for them. They had to perfect the skills of testing spacecraft systems, practicing spacewalks, and preparing for the intense forces that they would experience at launch and in orbit. Every single mission was dangerous in one aspect, and those dangers would become clear in 1967. On the evening of January 27th, at the Cape Canaveral launch site, the three astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward H. White, and Roger B. Chaffee of the planned Apollo 1 mission aboard the Saturn IB performed a routine launch rehearsal test. This meant that they had to enter the spacecraft, perform launch procedures, and test the systems to prepare them for the real launch. At 6:31 p.m., a fire broke out inside the spacecraft that eventually claimed the lives of these three astronauts. Investigators of the incident found that because the capsule was filled with pure oxygen, it created pressure that would not allow the astronauts to escape and posed a fire risk. And with a single spark, likely due to a faulty wire, the capsule was set ablaze and turned the promising test into a tragic event. The loss of these three brave adventurers devastated the entire nation. From the east to the west coast, the severity of the situation was felt, but their sacrifice would not be in vain. Over the next few months, the engineers and scientists behind the creation of both the Apollo Command Module and the Saturn 1B would work tirelessly to fix the mistakes that cost the lives of the astronauts. The entire spacecraft went under a redesign. Flammable materials were replaced, wiring was overhauled, and the hatch was rebuilt to open in a matter of seconds, so that in the event of an emergency, they would be able to get out, unlike the tragedy that came earlier. But before NASA could send a new group of astronauts to the moon, they first had to complete uncrewed launches to prove if they could trust the newly redesigned spacecraft and rocket. So for the next year, from 1967 to 1968, NASA carried out a series of uncrewed test flights that would allow them to make changes if needed. First up were supposed to be Apollo 2 and 3, but they were never launched due to these three numbers being retired in honor of the fallen astronauts. They then carried on to Apollo 4, which launched on November 9, 1967. This mission was the first test of the legendary Saturn V rocket that would later aid in the first moon landing. And just a few months later, in January 1968, Apollo 5 would take flight. The mission would test the advanced lunar module that the astronauts would be inside for their stay on the moon. In the mission, the engineers started to test the spacecraft's propulsion systems, starting the engines and seeing if they could move the spacecraft around. After Apollo 5 came Apollo 6, which would be the second test of the Saturn V. But this mission wouldn't go according to plan. The Saturn V suffered from an engine failure that was caused by pogo oscillations in its second stage. These oscillations were violent vibrations caused when the pressure of the rocket's engines started pushing against the fuel coming into the engine, limiting fuel flow and causing two engines to shut down. The second problem that the mission faced was that the third stage engines, which were supposed to be restarted in orbit to simulate a lunar trajectory, did not restart. These factors made the program experience setbacks as the engineers needed to fix these mistakes, but the mission collected crucial data that would help them for the next and arguably most important mission in the entire program, leading up to Apollo 11. After the engineers made the repairs to the Apollo spacecraft and the Saturn 1B, the stage was set for Apollo 7, the first crewed mission after the infamous fire that took the lives of some of the nation's best. Preparation for this mission was intense, as the astronauts were trained in every single emergency that they could think of. Each training session was rigged with its own challenges, from full-flight simulators to physical endurance tests. The training was challenging to both the astronauts and the engineers who needed them to operate the machines that they built. But just after 2 years of exhausting and grueling training, the astronauts Wally Schirra, Edward H. White, and Walter Cunningham were ready for the mission. On the morning of October 11, 1968, the atmosphere was intense. This was not only a matter of restoring faith in the Apollo program after the disastrous Apollo 1, but it was a moment of national pride in which the nation would be on the edge of their seats, hoping for a successful mission. And at exactly 11:02 a.m. at Launch Complex 34 in the Cape Kennedy Air Force Base, Apollo 7, aboard the Saturn 1B, launched into orbit, ready for the adventure that would come. Over the course of 11 days in Earth's orbit, these astronauts would brave the conditions of space, its extreme temperatures and the empty vacuum, which was a challenge for anyone who came unprepared, but they endured. In these 11 days, the astronauts would test every system that they were told to. This included propulsion, life support, navigation, communication, and the electrical system. On the ground, the American public was amazed at what they were seeing, as it was the first U.S. space mission to broadcast live television from Earth's orbit. After 11 days in orbit, the astronauts started to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. This would be marked as one of the most stressful moments in all of spaceflight. This moment would decide whether or not the U.S. could safely send astronauts to space and bring them back safely. But fortunately, they did it. Across the country, people celebrated as the U.S. had just sent the first crewed mission of the Apollo program to space. Apollo 7 not only proved the reliability of the spacecraft and rockets, but it also allowed NASA to take the next step into exploring space, the moon landing. With the success of Apollo 7, NASA quickly began work on the next part of the Apollo program, the adventure to the moon. For Apollo 8, NASA had to change a few things in comparison to the Apollo 7 mission. The first and the biggest change was the switch from the Saturn 1B to the powerful Saturn V rocket. Before they could use it for a mission, they had to fix the issues that plagued the Apollo 6 mission mentioned previously. The first was the pogo oscillation, which was fixed by helium gas being injected into the fuel lines. The fix decreased the pressure going back to the fuel tanks, allowing fuel to flow normally inside the system. The engineers also strengthened the structure of the fuel feed system to reduce the violent vibrations that were caused by the oscillations. The second issue they had to fix was the engine's restarting failing. This issue was resolved by enhancing the engine's ignition system and thermal protection to ensure reliable reignition. To test this fix, NASA also conducted numerous hot fire tests to simulate the long durations of time that these engines would have to operate. So there it was, the rocket that would send the first humans to the moon was completed. Standing at over 360 feet and weighing around 6.5 million pounds, it was the largest rocket ever built, only being dethroned after the creation of NASA's Space Launch System in 2019. This singular marvel of engineering was the joy of the entire nation. The Saturn V and its astronauts would soon make a legendary adventure to Earth's one and only moon. On the morning of December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 launched aboard the Saturn V rocket with Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders inside the Apollo command module. Around 11 minutes into the launch, the Saturn V had already reached Earth's orbit with its 5 F1 engines in the first stage, its 5 J2 engines in the second stage, and its singular J2 engine in the third stage. This quick approach was a testimony to how much NASA has learned since the mistakes of Apollo 6. After 2 hours and 44 minutes, the third stage engines lit and the mission began the translunar injection, which was a maneuver that pushed the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and set it on course for the moon. For the next 3 days of their journey, Apollo 8 coasted to the moon, not using its engines, but moving with the momentum it gained during launch. During their 3 days inside the spacecraft whilst coasting, the astronauts spend their time correcting their course and broadcasting the first live television footage from deep space. After their coast to the moon, it was now December 24th, Christmas Eve. Shortly after they arrived at the moon's orbit, they took the famous Earthrise picture, demonstrating how small we all look in comparison to the vast reaches of space. And after the picture was taken, the astronauts started a live broadcast from the moon's orbit where they read the book of Genesis from the Holy Bible to celebrate Christmas.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Though the astronauts did not celebrate the Christmas holiday with their families, they did experience it with all of mankind sitting right in front of them. After 10 days in orbit around the moon, their next step was to go back home. They first had to fire up the engines on their service module, which would set their trajectory to Earth. The voyage was similar to the coast from the Earth to the Moon. On this coast, they broadcast the journey back home to all the spectators on the bright blue planet. After around 3 days of coasting, they finally made it to Earth's atmosphere, and it was time to go home. They jettisoned the service module and made a re-entry back home safely, landing in the Pacific Ocean, southwest of Hawaii. When they made it back to the United States, they were rightfully treated as heroes. They were the first ever humans to make it to the orbit of the Moon, photograph the Earth from lunar orbit, broadcast live television from deep space, and the first to leave low Earth orbit. With the success of Apollo 8, Apollo 9 came shortly after. The engineers made important design changes to the spacecraft before it flew. This was the addition of the lunar module, known as Lunar LM. At its time, the lunar module was one of the most advanced technologies of its time, even rivaling the technology we have now. It was equipped with an advanced life support system and engines to descend onto the surface of the Moon and stay as a shelter for 2 astronauts who would conduct tests on the Moon. After these changes were completed, Apollo 9 was ready for liftoff. For the mission debriefing, the goal for the astronauts was to test the functions of the lunar, command, and service modules in Earth's orbit before they test these on an actual Moon mission. These tests made sure that the machines bringing new astronauts to the Moon would not fail during the mission and risk the astronauts' lives. And on March 3, 1969, Apollo 9 aboard the Saturn V rocket carrying James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweickart lifted off into the great beyond. When they finally reached low Earth orbit, they started to perform the tests that they were instructed to do. First up was testing the ascent and descent engines. These engines allowed the astronauts for the Moon mission to arrive on the lunar surface and get back to the command module, which orbited above. Second was separating the command module from the lunar module and then redocking. And finally, the third was performing spacewalks to ensure that they could transfer between spacecraft and that the suits, known as the Portable Life Support System, had the necessary life support systems to aid them in the environment of space. After around 10 days of conducting missions and recording observations, they re-entered Earth's atmosphere and landed in the North Atlantic Ocean. Shortly after they arrived back on Earth, the engineers examined the structure and data that the astronauts collected during the flight to make necessary changes. The short period of time between Apollos 9 and 10 would prove to be stressful for not only the engineers, but also the mathematicians in the Apollo program. They quickly made the changes they needed to optimize the next mission. The suit was given improved cooling so that the astronauts wouldn't overheat inside the suit during a mission. Next was the docking, which was given markings and more procedures to ensure a safer and easier experience. The final addition was for the lunar module's thrust control, which was smoothed to better control the landing they would perform in Apollo 11. So, after 2 stressful and intense months, Apollo 10 was ready for liftoff. On May 18, 1969, Apollo 10, aboard the Saturn V rocket, lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on its course to the Moon. After arriving in low Earth orbit, it performed the translunar injection to set its course for the Moon, and coasted for around 3 days, just like the mission that happened before it. But when they arrived at the Moon's orbit, the things they had to accomplish were different from the astronauts on Apollo 8. The first objective was to separate the lunar module from the command module and fly at 15 kilometers away from the command module, then reunite the two. The second task was to test the systems of the lunar module in lunar gravity. This included testing the ascent and descent engines, the navigation computers, and the overall handling of the landing craft. In addition, they tested the communications between the 2 parts of the Apollo spacecraft and Earth. The final task was to survey the land of the Moon, taking pictures of the surface and reporting its conditions. After all of these tasks were finished, they returned home to Earth. For another 3 days of their journey, they coasted back to Earth before entering Earth's atmosphere and landing in the Pacific Ocean. With their return home, the engineers started to prepare the next and probably the greatest mission that NASA has ever launched, even to this day, and this mission was known as Apollo 11. To fully understand the preparation behind this mission, we have to go back in time to 1968, a year before the Great Mission. During this time, the astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins started intensive training for the Apollo 11 mission. In these tests, the astronauts were given the new A7L pressure suit, a specially designed piece of equipment that would act as a spaceship for one while the astronauts were inside it. The A7L was restrictive and bulky, so the astronauts had to spend hours practicing how to walk and hold tools, all while being underwater and in pressure chambers to simulate the moon's gravity. In addition to practicing inside the suits, the three astronauts had to spend hundreds of hours inside the lunar module simulator, which allowed them to practice landing, troubleshoot issues, and control its engines. They also practiced with the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, which was notoriously hard to control, mimicking the environment they would be in during the actual mission. The last parts of training were dedicated to geology, where they would be sent to volcanic fields in Arizona and Nevada to practice collecting and identifying rocks. In summary, this training allowed them to hone their skills to prepare for the most important mission of all time. And with their training completed days before launch, they could now rest and wake up to a new adventure that would take them to the stars and beyond. At 4:15 a.m. on July 16, 1969, the three astronauts were awakened by the astronaut support crew, who helped prepare their breakfast of steak, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, and coffee, all part of the traditional astronaut pre-flight meal. The atmosphere before the mission was professional. Everyone acted as if it had been done 1,000 times before, showing how prepared they were for this mission. At around 6:27, they suited up in their A7L pressure suits, and at 6:52, they headed out to the launch site. At the same time, NASA began its live broadcast to the entire world, showing the events that took place during launch. When they got to Launch Complex 39A, they boarded the rocket, which was already full by the time they climbed into the command module. The next 2 hours included setting up the navigation computers, communication systems, and the launch controls. And at 9:32 a.m., it was go time.
Sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
As the Saturn V climbed into the sky, its 5 powerful engines roared with an intense fury, a beautiful moment for the propulsion engineers who worked on them. One by one, the rocket's enormous stages separated from one another. First was Stage 1, which fell to the Earth's surface and into its deep oceans after its 5 F1 engines completed their job. After the separation of Stage 1, Stage 2's 5 J2 engines roared to life, unleashing their full force and pushing the rocket to over 115 miles above sea level before separating with the remainder of the mighty vehicle. With the separation of Stage 2 came Stage 3, which ignited its singular J2 engine and pushed the spacecraft to low Earth orbit, where it would orbit the Earth one time for final systems checks and preparations. After these checks were completed, the engine roared back to life, performing the translunar injection to set course for the moon. Like all the previous missions, the spacecraft coasted to the moon for 3 days until making it to the moon's orbit. At the time, the astronauts started to prepare the lunar module for the landing and began separation. Right before the mission, it was decided that Collins would stay in the command module to monitor the operations below, while Armstrong and Aldrin would board the lunar module to descend to the moon's surface. And this is exactly what the crew did. As they separated from Collins' module, they began the greatest moment in history. The descent to the moon's surface was suspenseful and nerve-wracking for both Aldrin and Armstrong and the world listening to their calls on the radios. And after 12 stressful minutes, they called a touchdown. Across the entire nation, celebrations took place, not only from the engineers who worked tirelessly to get this mission off the ground, but also from the average citizen who was filled with a sense of national pride due to this great achievement. But it was not only the US that celebrated. The moment took the breath away from almost 650 million people on the entire planet. These are record-breaking numbers even for our time, and to make it more impressive, this was a time when TV was not as widespread as it is now. As Armstrong and Aldrin climbed out of the lunar module with Collins observing up above through radio, Armstrong took the first ever step on the moon and planted the US flag onto the rocky soil.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And so there it was, the object that hovered over our night sky, unable to be touched, was conquered by our curiosity and innovation. Soon after Armstrong took his step on the moon, Aldrin came outside of the lunar module, ready to explore the surface with him. For the next 21 hours and 36 minutes, they would travel the surface of the gray object, conducting experiments, taking pictures, and collecting samples. One of these experiments was deploying the early Apollo Scientific Experiments package, which included a device to measure solar wind, a retroflector for laser beams from Earth, and a passive seismometer to measure moonquakes. In addition, they were able to communicate with Mission Control in Houston, allowing them to report mission details and observations to the workers on the ground. After close to a day of performing experiments and collecting data, Armstrong and Aldrin made their way back to the command module to head back to Earth. For their ascent to the command module, the engines lit and pushed them to over 3,600 miles per hour. After 2 hours of traveling, they were redocked with the command module and reunited with Collins. Soon after the redocking, the astronauts made the journey back to Earth, taking around 2.5 days to complete, and then landed in the Pacific Ocean. When they returned, they were placed into a 21-day quarantine as a precautionary measure to avoid the spread of moon germs that they thought the astronauts could get, and 3 days after their release from quarantine, they hosted the August 13th celebratory parade for the astronauts. Across the nation, citizens cheered and celebrated for both the nation and the astronauts. It was truly the most important achievement in the history of human exploration. For the next 3 years, the Apollo program would have 6 more missions that would further aid humanity's goal in exploring the moon. In Apollo 12, NASA landed their astronauts in the Ocean of Storms, which allowed them to visit the Surveyor 3 probe that landed years before and retrieve some of its parts. Next came Apollo 13, often described as a successful failure. On the afternoon of April 11, 1970, it was set to take off to the moon to further deepen NASA's understanding of our natural satellite, but due to an electrical fault, a spark ignited the insulation, which caused the oxygen tanks inside of the spacecraft to explode. This is where the famous line, "Houston, we have a problem," spoken by Jim Lovell, comes from. Fortunately, due to good training and pure luck, the astronauts were able to evacuate to the lunar module and landed in the Pacific Ocean, before being picked up by the recovery ship USS Iwo Jima. After the mission's end, experts acknowledged the good training that was used to save the astronauts in the explosion. After the Apollo 13 disaster, Apollo 14 would come, which explored the moon's Fra Mauro Highlands, where the astronaut Alan Shepard would hit 2 golf balls on the surface of the moon. Soon after was Apollo 15, which would bring the first lunar roving vehicle to the moon, This vehicle, with its mesh tires and four-wheel drive and steering, would allow the astronauts to explore and traverse the surface of the moon more quickly and more efficiently. After Apollo 15 came Apollo 16, which would explore the lunar highlands, testing mobility, gathering more data about the lunar terrain, and finally, in December 1972, Apollo 17 would come and become the longest and last ever mission of the Apollo program. It gave NASA the most detailed report on lunar terrain, collecting rocks, samples, and data about seismic activity on the moon. Throughout the lifespan of the Apollo program, it showed the reliance and innovation NASA had, from the tragic disaster of Apollo 1 to the triumph of Apollo 11 and to the ending mission of Apollo 17. The program faced hardship after hardship, but still managed to become the most famous and legendary space program in the entire world. Without the help of the brilliant scientists, engineers, and astronauts, this program wouldn't have achieved what it could in such a short period of time. If it went for longer, you could predict it would have found way more about the moon than what we could ever think of. And when you look at the rockets that fly today, just remember the great program that came before them. Thank you for watching the entire history of the Apollo program. If you have reached this part of the video, thank you for watching. I love that every single video I create gives people information that they either already knew and wanted to learn more about, or did not know and wanted to learn about. And that's basically it. Thank you for watching.